Today I'm going to talk about Madame Brussels, and I'll be telling you some of her life story, but I'll also be talking about how I've learnt about her and some of the mistakes I've made along the way. The pitfalls of relying on different kinds of evidence to build up a story about anyone's life. So this is Madame Brussels. She is Melbourne's most famous flash madam of the 19th century. There's a city bar named after her. There's also Madame Brussels Lane, which you may have come across, in Lonsdale Street. It's near where her brothels were located. But neither of these places are actually where she lived or worked. They're just roundabout. The bar is not even in Lonsdale Street. So Madame Brussels' brothels were all located at the Spring Street end of Lonsdale Street. So on the southern end of this block called the Commonwealth Block, it's named that because it was purchased by the government for officers in 1950. And as you can see, Madame Brussels' brothels were conveniently located between the exhibition buildings, Parliament House, and down here is the entertainment precinct. And of course, they were all gathering places for men, which of course for Madame Brussels meant business. This is what the street looked like in the mid-1870s when Madame Brussels bought her first house in the street. It's behind the picket fence down here. We have no pictures of the direct frontage of her place at all. I've hunted high and low. At this stage, the houses immediately below the Star of the East Hotel, which is here on the corner, were all small businesses. Seafarth the tailor and Dorsey the clothes cleaner, for example. But during Victoria's boom years of the 1880s, Madame Brussels progressively bought up adjoining properties behind the picket fence. So she ended up with 3 frontages onto Lonsdale Street there. And she was also renting various ones of these houses from the 1880s on. So in the houses that she owned, one of the houses she lived in, she combined the other 2 to become a brothel and a garden. And that's where she entertained her clientele from places like the Melbourne Club, because they needed a garden, of course. The building supposedly had carpets like meadow grass, but we do know they had curtains of guipure lace with rose satin window valances. They were decorated with marble and alabaster nudes. But she did have the garden and the summer house with a grand piano and a room for dancing. It was an entertainment centre as much as it was a brothel. So by the 1890s, most of the houses that you can see here between what had become the South Australian Club Hotel, right the way down to the Wesley Church, which is the spire here, most of those houses by then were brothels. Madame Brussels had quite a few of them. This one here was one of her rented houses, and she called it Bellevue House. It was for her lesser quality clientele, if you like. It was the less expensive one. So this was true right through till 1907, which is when prostitution became illegal in Victoria. That was what closed all of her houses and all the rest. But by then, Madame Brussels had a reputation as the worst and wickedest woman in Melbourne. The newspapers said she systematically degraded the bodies and damned the souls of frail, fallen girls. In short, they described her as this disgusting drab of Lonsdale Street, and she was painted by the newspapers as a moral monster. Now, let me start the story again. This is Caroline Hodgson. She was born in Germany. Her mother died when she was 7. After that, she progressively lost her stepmother, several siblings, and then her father. By the time she was 14, she was not only an orphan, but she had, with one older sister, she had several younger siblings to support. Now, we don't actually know how she did it, because we haven't been able to track her between there and when she married her husband in London in 1871. She seems to have been working there as a domestic servant in a respectable boarding house in London. They were married at St George's, Hanover Square in 1871. And they probably dashed across to meet his parents in Brussels, where this photograph was taken, which is one of the clues that sent us into figuring out this was actually Madame Brussels. 3 weeks after their wedding, they were on a boat bound for Melbourne. Caroline's husband's name was Studholme. He was known as Stud. He had a brother called John, who was a sailor, and they were good mates. Their beards were fairly standard for the time, but Stud's was generally quite wild and his brother's was very neat. Caroline and Stud came to Melbourne because John and his wife Lizzie Jane were already here, with their second baby having just arrived. John was sailing on a merchant ship to and fro between Melbourne and Adelaide. Lizzie Jane on the left and Caroline on the right became lifelong friends, which is how we come to have the photographs, because Lizzie Jane's great-great-grandson in London read an article that I and a colleague had written, and he rang up and said, "Well, we've got some of her memorabilia. What should I do with them?" I said, "Have you got any photographs?" And he said, "No, there was a little album of photos, but we didn't know who anybody was, so I gave it to my niece for her children to play with." So I said, "Can you get it back?" And he did. These are now all in the State Library, Victoria, as a donation from that family. Both of these women ended up living the majority of their lives without their husbands. John left Lizzie Jane, went back to England. That left her in Sydney with 3 teenage children. 2 years after Stud and Caroline arrived in Melbourne, he joined the Victorian Police Force. He went up country for 20 years. That left Caroline in Melbourne with no children and no income. What could a woman do in the 19th century, left in Melbourne with no capital, no breadwinner, and not much English? Caroline's solution was to set up a boarding house, an ordinary boarding house in a brand new terrace in North Melbourne. Hers was number 1, the first on the left. But somewhere in the first year that she ran that business, she worked out that there was a lot more money to be made running the house next door as a brothel. Caroline made a lot of money very quickly. 3 years later, she bought the first of her houses in Lonsdale Street, and 3 years after that, she adopted the business name Madame Brussels. From that time on, Caroline Hodgson gradually disappeared from the newspapers, and Madame Brussels took over. Partly it was a kind of advertising ploy for her business, because Brussels was known for its regulated trade in prostitution in this era. That meant clean women, because they had legislation that required sex workers to be medically checked regularly, and they were confined to lock hospitals if they were found to be infected. So Caroline was also, I think, playing on her German accent as an indicator of European sophistication. She smoked using a meerschaum cigarette holder. Fairly classic. But I think Caroline was also protecting her husband from her growing reputation. Because he was a policeman, sex work was not illegal in this period, but it was not respectable either, and it could certainly have been used against him as a policeman to have that known. Caroline certainly ended up in court for things like selling sly grog after hours, because alcohol was obviously a big part of the business. So she was protecting him by keeping a low profile. The newspapers in this era referred to her as Carrie Brussels rather than Caroline Hodgson. So family was actually fairly important to Caroline. The house that she actually lived in, she was not trying to separate herself from her husband, even though he'd gone. The house that she actually lived in, she called Studholme Villa. And if she ever advertised for lost items, like the meerschaum cigarette holder, she advertised it from Studholme Villa. So I think she was not unattached from her husband. She never had any children of her own. She did adopt one, though. The only time she used her real name in a newspaper advertisement was when she was hoping to locate the mother of an abandoned baby. The mother didn't come back, so Caroline adopted the baby. She renamed her Irene Hodgson. When Irene was about 5 years old, she and Caroline had a visitor from Sydney, Charlie. Charlie was John and Lizzie Jane's son, lived with his mother in Sydney. And when he was 19, Charlie came to Melbourne for a visit. And when he went home again, Caroline wrote to him. He was a handsome young man, as you can see, The letter Caroline sent to him indicated that he got on well with everyone, including the girls. Caroline had obviously enjoyed having him. Not long after he went home, Stud came back. 20 years after they separated, Stud was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He resigned from the police force and came back to his wife to die. Caroline employed a nurse and a housekeeper to look after him, and she set him up in her weekender overlooking Port Phillip Bay. For a while, Caroline had a family. It lasted about 7 months until Stud died. And then Caroline gave him a very fancy, very expensive funeral. When she went to bury him, she bought 3 grave sites at the St Kilda Cemetery, presumably one for each of herself, her husband, and her adopted daughter. Now, so far, as a life story goes, it doesn't really add up to Caroline being a moral monster, does it? She's loved by her religious in-laws. She's taken in an orphan. She educated her at a convent, but she's looked after her sick husband. But there are stories in the newspapers that the archives don't tell us, and vice versa. So let's begin with money. Caroline liked money. You can see it in her clothes. Every ruffle and fringe is handmade, and gold and diamonds in her probate papers added up to a considerable sum. Most of her money, though, went into property. When she died, she owned not only what had become 4 adjoining properties in Lonsdale Street and her place on Beaconsfield Parade, but also the house at the back of hers, behind Beaconsfield Parade, 2 adjoining houses in Middle Park, and another substantial house in Park Street, St Kilda. That's a lot of money to make in 20 years. But it wasn't just about charging for services that her houses provided. Caroline was also canny. After she bought her first house in Lonsdale Street, she decided it needed some renovations. So she thought she'd move out to another house for 6 weeks while the renovations were done. So she hired a house from another madam, another one of Melbourne's madams, for £3 a week. That's fine, 6 weeks, £3 a week, £18. She paid the first week's rent, but after that, every time the rent collector came around, Caroline was out. She didn't pay the rent. So after 6 weeks, she moved back to her own place, sorting that out. Mrs. West, that she'd rented the place from, took her to court. Said, I want my £15, thanks. But there is a British law that you cannot recover a debt owing on an immoral contract. Caroline's lawyer obviously knew about it. She walked free, never paid the money. Which you can imagine what that made to the friendliness in the street, because Caroline actually was next door to the woman who also owned this place she refused to pay. So Caroline went back to running her own immoral house. That's the sort of information you don't find in the archives. But because of the court reports, you can put it together from the newspapers. There are other things in the newspapers too. This would seem like an ordinary factual court report, but there are 2 problems with it. Women from Madame Russell's house did not solicit in the streets in this period. They didn't need to. So what was May Crawford doing on the street? The second problem is that Madame Russell's houses were actually not operating at this time because she was in Germany with her second husband and she'd closed them down. So what we can see here is the effect of a woman's reputation on a journalist's reporting. This article's from the Daily Telegraph. It's a staunchly conservative paper. If you read the report from The Age on the same event, you find that the woman was soliciting in an area near where Madame Russell's brothels were located, and the journalist simply jumped to a conclusion. It's the sort of thing that happens all the time, especially in this era when men are reporting about women, or Aborigines, or the Chinese, or the Syrians, etc. It's about the journalist's underlying attitudes, and it's about reputation. So in Madame Russell's case, there were 2 men in particular who are responsible for all of you being here today. These two men had such bees in their bonnets about one particular flash madam that they turned her into a symbol of the sex industry in Melbourne. They gave her a reputation that's lasted over 100 years. Madame Brussels was not the only flash madam in Melbourne in this period. She might have been the only one catering to the men from the Melbourne Club for a short time, but Mrs. Kemp had been quietly catering to the men of the Australian Club and the Yorick Club since way before Carolyn came to Melbourne. Mrs. Kemp ran her house so quietly that the one police report that mentions her calls her Janet when her name was actually Mary Jane. There were plenty of other flash madams too, but the two men who were fixated on Madame Brussels were both colourful fiction writers. So I'll start with Henry Varley. Henry Varley was a fire and brimstone preacher who took Melbourne by storm towards the end of its boom years in the 1880s. He took it upon himself to cleanse the city of its vices. To begin with, he was concerned with lecturing men and boys over 16 about the evils of skating rinks and masturbation. But he quickly moved on to fulminating against prostitution in general and Madame Brussels in particular. He accused her in particular of depravity and procuring, decoying and ruining young girls, leading them into a life of shame, etc. Sex work was not illegal at this time, but Varley's moral judgment said that it ought to be. So all of the women in Little Lon that I researched for this book were doing sex work for a living. Many of them were deserted wives, widows, single mothers trying to raise children. There were no pensions for anybody in this period. The kinds of jobs available to such women in those days tended to have very long hours and very poor pay, if they could get them at all, because a lot of respectable people refused to employ single mothers, for example, because of their perceived moral deficiency. But for a man like Henry Varley, sex work had nothing to do with economics and everything to do with the women's moral failings. He phrased his lectures in blunt, colourful language, and his audiences loved it. He gained quite a following and became culturally very influential, along with groups like the Salvation Army. But at least the Salvos gave the women Christmas dinner rather than a tongue lashing. Henry Varley took a set against Caroline Hodgson to the point of being abusive. But his stories were very quotable, so they're often repeated even now. There's one story in particular that he told many, many times, and he claimed that she was seen parading the block in charge of a beautiful girl with a white feather in her hat. The feather meaning virginity for sale. Now, the context for this is that there were no cures for sexually transmitted infections in the 19th century. There were no antibiotics. If you got syphilis, there was no going back, no cures. But there was a very old belief, still current in the community, that a man could cure his syphilis by having sex with a virgin. It gives you the horrors, doesn't it? So what Varley was suggesting here was that Madame Brussels was offering to sell a virgin for this purpose. Having researched Caroline Hodgson and her business, I can tell you that there are a number of problems with this. First, white feathers didn't actually mean virginity in Melbourne in the 19th century. They were extremely fashionable for everyone, including royalty and including grandmothers like me. Second, Caroline Hodgson styled herself as a boarding house keeper. When one young girl tried to take a room at her brothel, Caroline didn't accept her as a boarder. She was too young. She took her home to her mother. This lass said this in court. Third, when another young woman turned up at the brothel, already having what was termed venereal disease, Caroline Hodgson took her in, but she didn't allow her to work. She called a doctor instead. The thing about Madame Brussels is that she was trading on Brussels as a clean brothel, and it was important to her. Finally, I found a letter in the police archives from a man called John Gibbs. Don't try and read it, it's appalling, but I like to show it. John Gibbs had written to the police asking them to get back a letter he'd written to Henry Varley because Varley was misusing it. His letter was about a girl he was fond of who was being paraded in Collins Street by Madame Brussels with a white feather in her hat. He did not claim she was a virgin. In fact, quite the opposite. He did say he'd sent the letter in a fit of madness. The timing suggests that this is the source of Varley's story about the white feather. The police investigated and said John Gibbs was a man of great imagination and very weak intellect. He actually died in the Ararat Lunatic Asylum. Varley refused to return Gibbs's letter and went on using the story that he'd created from John Gibbs' imagination. In fact, he published it. It's been quoted and used by journalists and historians ever since because Varley had such a way with words that they accepted his story without checking it, which is like the story about the trade in virgins in Melbourne. This is a bit of a long one, sorry. In 1878, so I'm on my hobby horse here. In 1878, there was a select committee of Parliament on the question of whether Victoria should introduce contagious diseases legislation, like England had. Contagious diseases meaning syphilis, not what you might expect it to be with typhoid or cholera, syphilis. If they introduced this legislation, they were trying to find out if it could be controlled using lock hospitals and medical checks on sex workers. One of the witnesses called by the committee came up with a story about ex-convicts running a trade in virgins between Tasmania and Melbourne. The man who told it was a visitor to the city police court. That is, he worked for the city mission. He carried a Bible with its practical truths into the lanes and back slums of Melbourne. He also went to the syphilitic ward of the Melbourne hospital where he met a young girl who told him a story about being recruited by a woman, brought to Melbourne, drugged and introduced to the trade. Her story seems to have drawn his sympathy, as you could imagine, and led him to excusing her of responsibility because she'd been taken advantage of. The man turned that one girl's story into a wholesale trade in virgins between Tasmania and Melbourne. The committee questioned 27 witnesses, including police and doctors and a man who ran a home for fallen women. He'd had hundreds of women come to him. None of them mentioned anything about such a trade. In fact, the Chief Commissioner of Police explicitly said he didn't believe it existed. But it makes a good story, and it plays into the image of convicts as evil and immoral. So it gets repeated as though it's true because it appeared in a parliamentary paper, which is my point. From my perspective, it's essentially a hard luck story told by a girl who wanted a missionary to help her. Why not? But just because something's published doesn't mean it's true. Whether it's in a parliamentary report or a newspaper, we still have to think about the context it was written in and what might the writer have been trying to achieve. So given that the white feather didn't mean virginity, why did Henry Varley put it in brackets? Because like all fiction writers, Varley was working his audience. Just like the journalist we met at the beginning who liked alliteration. Remember these. The journalist who wrote them was a man called John Norton, who was the editor and owner of the newspaper Truth. He loved alliteration like this, and he also loved alcohol. In fact, his biographer said that you could tell how drunk he was when he wrote an article by the amount of alliteration in it. He obviously drank a lot when he was writing about Carolyn Hodgson. He also, like Varley, wrote a lot of fiction. So take this small piece, for example. Her husband was a highly educated Belgian engineer. She married twice. We know about one. He was English. Her second husband was German, not Belgian. Although he did become an engineer, he also abandoned her. After Studd died in 1893, Carolyn settled her affairs in Melbourne and took Irene and a maid off to Germany to visit her sisters. While she was there, she met the engineer and brought him back to Melbourne. They married at St Patrick's Cathedral as soon as they arrived. And now we're going to talk about the reliability of official records. I'll start with Studd's police record of conduct. When Studd applied to join the Victorian Police, he told them he was born in 1843. He was actually born in 1835, making him 37 years of age. The context here is that the police had a rule at that time about not recruiting anyone under the age of 30. 1843 miraculously put Studd at 29. These are Carolyn Hodgson's 2 marriage registrations. The top one comes from London in 1871, bottom one's from St Patrick's, 1895. Many years ago, someone transcribed Carolyn's family name from the top document into an index of births, deaths and marriages as Lohman, with an N on the end. It should have been Lomar, with an R on the end. If you look up the State Library catalogue for Carolyn Hodgson's photographs, which I placed there with the help of the family, I thought it was Lohman, so I put Lohman. So you'll find my error sitting in the State Library of Victoria. Very proud of that one. Not. My focus here, though, is their ages. If Studd was born in 1835, he should have been 36 in 1871, but he claimed he was 33. If Carolyn was 22 in 1871, as she said, she should have been 46. She said she's 44. Here are social expectations we can see. The age difference between a husband and a wife tends to be minimised. We can see that in the way The Truth reported Carolyn's divorce papers. She closed her brothels when she got married again in 1895. Her second husband lived off her in Melbourne for nearly a year, and then she bought tickets for them both to travel back to Germany. When they got there, she went to stay with her sister for a while, and he went to stay with his parents, and then took off to South Africa without telling her. She came back to Melbourne, opened her brothels again. She was short on money, needed an income. He'd almost bled her dry. A few years later, he turned up in Melbourne again. Carolyn says she tried to make the marriage work, but her husband disappeared a second time. When she finally petitioned for divorce years later, Truth reported the proceedings under this heading. Truth claimed that when the divorce documents were served on her errant husband, he said to a friend who was there, "Come and have a drink, old man. This is the best news I've had for a very long time. She's too old for me." And just to make the story even better, he supposedly added, "I want something like this," pointing to the young woman beside him. The Truth reporter was not at the court when the divorce proceedings took place. He admitted he didn't even know about it until weeks afterwards. But we can see the social expectations at work. It's the same thing. We're minimising ages. We're making judgments on the basis of it. It even appears on the official documents. I want to talk a bit more about this notion of context and official documents, but I'm going to take you away from Madame Brussels for a moment and into the back lanes of Little Lon. Madame Brussels' expensive establishments had Main Street frontage to Lonsdale Street, but it was Little Lonsdale Street that gave the area its name, Little Lon, and also its reputation as this filthy, vice-filled slum. You might be familiar with C.J. Dennis's Songs of a Sentimental Bloke when he said, "They deals it out with bricks and boots in Little Lon. They're low, degraded brutes." There's the reputation. The women who worked in the back lanes were much poorer than the ones in Madame Brussels' brothels, but sometimes they were able to move from being back lane sex workers to being front lane madams running their own businesses. Mary Ann Williams was one of these. She had a very poor beginning in Little Lon's lanes. Mary Ann gave birth to 2 babies 2 years apart in a tiny falling down shanty in Little Lon. She gave them the same name, Adelaide Mary Jane Williams. First baby born 1873, died 1874. Second one born 1875, died 6 days later. Adelaide turned out to be where Mary Ann had met her husband, George Williams, except he wasn't her husband and that wasn't his real name, just as Mary Ann Williams wasn't her real name either. They both left their old names and their old marriages in Adelaide and came to Melbourne together. Now, looking at the birth registrations for the two Adelaides, both parents were the same age, 32 and 30, 32 and 30, 2 years apart. Mary Ann gave a different maiden name for the birth of her first. She says she's Crozier here, but she's Cropley in the others. The birth certificates give two different marriage dates, 1856 and 1870. But I never found a marriage for them at all because they left their old marriages behind and they never actually married. The column previous issue also has different names in it. Names here, names here. All of these documents name George Williams as the father, but he couldn't possibly have been the father because he did several 12-month stretches in jail. So what you're seeing here is what? A pair of serial liars, illiterate slum dwellers with no respect for the truth. As researchers, we tend to consider birth, death and marriage certificates as the source of our base data. That's where we get our family accurate information from. But how many of you have had to sit with a funeral director and answer the questions they ask about a loved one? What was their mother's maiden name? How old were they? Where were they born? How long have they been in Victoria? Researching people in Little Lon has taught me that people often didn't know the answers to these questions. They didn't necessarily know how old they were themselves, much less anyone else's story, their friends or their relationships, which is why I regard the most important column on these documents as this one, the informant. Who is providing the information? As you can see, none of the informants on Adelaide Mary Jane Williams documents were actually a mother. Her father gave this one, and this was a friend. This lady was actually the Little Lon midwife. So she was a friend. They all knew each other very well, but how much did they know about each other? So now we can start thinking about the meaning of the information on these certificates and why it was so often wrong. One of the things this particular batch of documents taught me was the ambiguity in the column, issue, living and deceased, meaning siblings. Whose issue are they? Are they fathers? Are they the mothers? Do they belong to the marriage? We don't know. Now, after that digression, let's go back to Madame Brussels. Having poured doubt on the idea of getting reliable information from official documents, I thought I should wax lyrical for a while about the extraordinary things you can find in the archives. You can't get these anywhere else. The breadth and depth of Carolyn Hodgson's links in the community, for example. The one I love here, you can see there's milk, there's bread, there's groceries and everything, but the one I love is Mrs. Khan, 19 Little George Street, Fitzroy. She sells underwear, so we know where Carolyn bought her underwear. The other one I love is Miss Dr. Sterling of Lonsdale Street. Once you start hunting down Dr. Sterling of Lonsdale Street, you discover his divorce papers, which are also here in the archives. Then you find out that he was in the habit of picking up young women in a cab and taking them to hotels for an hour or two. And then if you read the newspapers, they tell you that part of Madame Brussels' business was providing a safe space for the upper crust in Melbourne to conduct their extramarital affairs. So then you start thinking, was he taking advantage of her business as much as she was actually using his? Perhaps he was. So combining this with the gossip you can get from the newspapers, the probate papers are fabulous, as can inquest papers be fabulous. Now I'm going to take you away from Madame Brussels again just for a moment because I want to show you my favourite find from here in the archives, my favourite find of all time. It comes from a set of inquest papers for a woman called Emily Westcott. Her daughter, Emma Westcott, was another one of the madams who took a house between Madame Brussels' houses. Hers were also closed down in 1907. Emily died, her mother died in 1877. The daughter was only 12 years old. The document I'm going to show you is part of the policeman's deposition at her inquest. I'll read it to you. It appears that the deceased had been complaining of rheumatics in her arms and legs for the last 18 months, during which time she's done no work. But through having been an old servant of Mrs. Fraser's of Stephen Street, she received her wages as usual during that time. Now, Mrs. Fraser of Stephen Street was Melbourne's flashiest brothel owner until she died in 1880, when Caroline took over. So Mrs. Fraser's house entertained Queen Victoria's son, the Duke of Edinburgh, in 1867, and it's quite likely that Emily Westcott was actually working there at that time as a domestic servant. So she became sick and Mrs. Fraser kept paying her for 18 months until she died. That's the sort of information you won't find reported in the newspapers, especially about a woman like Mrs. Fraser or Caroline Hodgson. How many employers do you know who would do that? So I got involved in writing about the Women of Little Lon because I got annoyed, I'll be honest, by the negativity and the moral judgment that was constantly directed at them by journalists and writers and so on, record keepers generally, without any balancing view of what life was like for the women themselves. In the process of researching their lives, though, I came to understand much more about the importance of understanding what was behind the records, who was saying these things, for what purpose were they writing the records, in whose interests were those records written. For example, in 1889, Henry Varley teamed up with the Colonel of the Salvation Army to try and put Madame Brussels out of business. They found 4 girls they thought would give evidence against her. She was charged with being a keeper of a disorderly house. Unfortunately for Varley, it turned out the girls had all been on the town before they went to Madame Brussels. One of them was the one who already had the sexually transmitted infection. In trying to push these girls forward as reliable witnesses against Caroline Hodgson, the police in the girls' hometowns were contacted. It was fairly clear the prosecutors wanted them to say the girls were sweet and innocent until Madame Brussels got her hands on them, but that wasn't what they got from the police on the beat. Constable Smith from Footscray said he'd known 2 of them for about 5 years and he'd watched them in the streets late at night in company with larrikins. He said he had no proof that they'd ever solicited prostitution, but their behaviour was that of common prostitutes. Rather than condemning the girls, the tone of his report was one of, and? They're just girls from poor backgrounds, and? The constables on the beat in Little Lon were much the same. Their reports were bland because they saw no problem with Madame Brussels' business. There'd been no robberies committed in them, no violence, and as far as they were concerned, the women were just going quietly about their business. Their reports were not what Varley and his co-conspirators wanted or expected. And the difference was the class of men doing the reporting. Constables on the beat were from the same strata of society as the girls who were doing this work. They weren't offended by the women in the way that the likes of Varley were offended by them. They understood poverty, and there's a kind of acceptance and lack of moral judgment in their words. So, just to finish the story, Caroline Hodgson was charged with running a disorderly house 4 times between 1889 and 1907. After the last trial, the magistrate ordered her not only to close her business, but to sell her houses. The magistrate retired 6 weeks later, about the time the law was changed, making it illegal for anyone, including madams and most especially landlords, to make a profit from prostitution. But Caroline was already very ill by then. She had diabetes. Her brothels had been closed. She probably moved to St Kilda for a time, enjoyed the sea air, mollify the magistrates, and then moved back to Lonsdale Street, which is where she died the following year. So, just to sum up, is there a difference between history from the archives and history from the newspapers? Not really. There's biases and attitudes everywhere. And as a historian looking for facts, you look everywhere, you check everything, you find no matter where it comes from. And as a historian looking to understand people and places and events, you integrate it all and you try to turn it into a context that makes sense. But that's no different to what all of us need to do every day anyway. Whenever we read or hear anything, we need to ask who is saying this and why are they saying it? Whose interests are being served by what they're saying? Am I reading The Age or The Australian or The Truth? It's especially important when we're interested in women like Caroline Hodgson in the 19th century that we also ask whose voice is not being heard. Thank you.